Today is the 12th Sunday after Pentecost. The epistle is taken here in Massachusetts. The epistle is taken from 2 Corinthians chapter 3, St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians. Brethren, such confidence we have through Christ towards God, not that we are sufficient to think anything of ourselves as of ourselves, but our sufficiency is from God, who also has made us fit ministers of the New Testament, not in the letter, but in the Spirit. For the letter killeth, but the Spirit giveth life. Now, if the ministration of death, engraven with letters upon stones, was glorious, so that the children of Israel could not steadfastly behold the face of Moses, for the glory of his countenance, which is made void, how shall not the ministration of the Spirit be rather in glory? For if the ministration of condemnation be glory, much more the ministration of justice aboundeth in glory. The Holy Gospel. From St. Luke chapter 10. At that time Jesus said to his disciples, Blessed are the eyes that see the things which you see. For I say to you that many prophets and kings have desired to see the things that you see, and have not seen them, and to hear the things that you hear, and have not heard them. And behold, a certain lawyer stood up, tempting him, and saying, Master, what must I do to possess eternal life? But he said to him, What is written in the law? How readest thou? He answering said, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with thy whole heart, and with thy whole soul, and with all thy strength, and with all thy mind, and thy neighbor as thyself. And he said to him, Thou hast answered correctly. Do this, and thou shalt live. But he, willing to justify himself, said to Jesus, And who is my neighbor? And Jesus answering said, A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and fell among robbers, who also stripped him, and having wounded him, went away, leaving him half dead. And it chanced that a certain priest went down the same way, and seeing him, passed by. In like manner also a Levite, when he was near the place, and saw him, passed by. But a certain Samaritan, being on his journey, came near him, and seeing him, was moved with compassion, and going up to him, bound up his wounds, pouring in oil and wine, and setting him upon his own beast, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 pence, and gave to the host, and said, Take care of him, and whatsoever thou shalt spend over and above, I at my return will repay thee. Which of these 3, in thy opinion, was neighbor to him that fell among robbers? But he said, He that showed mercy to him. And Jesus said to him, Go, and do thou in like manner. Thus are the words of the Holy Gospel. By way of announcement, please pray for Tom Carroll. He was an old man who died in Philadelphia. I did give him extreme unction, and he was always with the Catholic Resistance. And pray for his soul, Tom Carroll. He used to serve Mass often when I went down there, and he used to serve as a boy, the Tridentine Mass. So pray for his soul. Also remember Gabrielle Schultz, who died from cancer at around age 29, 30. And by way of announcement also, a word must be said about Bishop Williamson's interview this month, 2022 in August. There was an interview he had with E. Michael Jones. And unfortunately, it just manifests everything contrary to Archbishop Lefebvre. Here was a bishop consecrated by Archbishop Lefebvre who should just simply preach the Catholic faith and defend the faith and do what Archbishop Lefebvre did, which is warn people, do not go to the new Mass. If you go to the new Mass, it'll erode your faith. It's poisonous. It's dangerous to the faith. Archbishop Lefebvre used to say, if I go to the new Mass on a Sunday, does it fulfill my Sunday obligation? Somebody asked him. He said no, because it does not represent the Catholic faith. You do not fulfill your Sunday obligation going to the new Mass. That's Archbishop Lefebvre. And Archbishop Lefebvre warned the faithful, and especially his priests. He says in his book, Spiritual Journeys, on page 13, he says very loud and clear, it is essential for a Catholic priest to stay Catholic. And if this goes to the priest, it goes to the laity as well. To remain Catholic, he must separate himself from the conciliar church. That's Archbishop Lefebvre, because he's a father of souls. He is what the gospel says in this gospel. The Good Samaritan who had mercy and compassion and pours in oil and wine and brings him on his own beast and puts him in a hotel. That hotel is the Catholic Church. And that oil and wine, says St. Augustine, is the sacraments of the Catholic Church. But the other priests, the Levite and the priests that walk by, they are, we can truly say, the priests of the new rite, of the new conciliar church. Bastard priests, says Archbishop Lefebvre, who give bastard sacraments, who are doubtful sacraments, doubtful validity of their priesthood. So they walk by, they might be nice, they might be charitable, but they can't give the good oil and wine because they've been mixed and watered down and even filled with poison with the new sacraments. So Archbishop Lefebvre, he is that good Samaritan who just did what Christ did, had mercy on us and gives us his grace and his precious blood and his own body, blood, soul, and divinity in the sacraments. That's what he gives. And no one can distort this. No one can change the sacraments. No pope, no matter how holy or how high he might be, he can never change the sacraments. He can never change the doctrine. And the Council of Vatican I in 1870 defined this for our age. Because we would see an age where the popes have dared to change the sacraments, change the Mass, change the doctrine. And Catholics will be confused. Oh, but he's the Pope, we have to obey him. Everything he says is true. But the Church never taught this. The Church teaches the duty of the Pope is to hand down what has always been taught. He cannot change and tamper with the sacraments. And he cannot invent new doctrine like ecumenism, religious liberty, collegiality, and a new Mass. And yet, that's what Pope John the 23rd, Pope Paul VI, Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict XVI, and Pope Francis are doing exactly this. And Pope Francis is now shoving down everyone's throat you must accept and obey the new Mass. And that's false obedience. Now that's bad enough when you get Cardinal Burke, you get modernist bishops who try to find your conservative Novus Ordo priest. But who would have ever thought we would hear this from a bishop consecrated by Archbishop Lefebvre? So God will judge Bishop Williamson, but we have to, in charity, judge what he says. And what he says is poison. And if I say it, take your eggs and tomatoes and nail me against the wall. Boys, take your paintball guns and just plaster me against the wall, because I deserve it if I speak like this. In the interview, at 1 hour and 19 minutes, the interviewer states he will only receive sacraments from certainly valid priests who are also not imposing any heresy. Bishop Williamson says again that you can look for an older priest in your diocese, and you'll also find a network of young priests who in private will tell you what they really think. They want tradition. Remember, these young priests are formed in modernism. they might want tradition, but what are they doing about it? They're obeying their local bishop and swallowing and teaching all the poison. So if they want tradition, they got to come to tradition and not play games with Christ. But here in interview, 1 hour, 23 minutes, the poor interviewer objects again that Vatican II is a Protestant religion where people believe abortion and homosexuality are okay in some circumstances. And you're telling me to wade in this cesspool to maybe find a priest to hear my confession? This church is fake, Protestant, communist. Mr. Jones is right. At 1 hour and 29 minutes, Bishop Williamson says the Novus Ordo is a half-poisoned cake. But if it's only half poisoned, that means there's a half that's not poisoned. And if you use your mind, you can distinguish what is poison and what is not. Yet he really said that what happened to one tiny drop of poison in a glass of water is enough to kill. So, half a poison cake, the other half will be okay to eat. Well, poison, as Archbishop Lefebvre said, the poison of the heresies of Vatican II permeate everything taught at Vatican II. So you got to reject the whole thing, otherwise you will be poisoned. Can you picture Archbishop Lefebvre saying this? He's not finished. 1 hour and 30 minutes. This begins a discussion of his firm belief in the Novus Ordo Eucharistic miracles, so-called. Bishop Williamson adamantly defends them as true, which leads to the conclusion that the Novus Ordo is certainly valid, and that, quote, there is grace in the Novus Ordo. It was always the practice of the Church to put these miracles through a rigid test and research, and only the legitimate Church authorities, prior to Vatican II, of course, could rule on them. The devil also has been given power to work miracles, and could it not be possible that he is using this means to lead souls into error? So again, Bishop Williamson pushes the new miracles of the new Mass. What does that do? If you go see a so-called new miracle of a new Mass, what's going to happen to your faith? You go to that new Mass, they're giving communion in the hand, they're singing, they're clapping, the women are reading the Epistle and Gospel. You're going to think, well, if there's a real miracle with the new Mass, then it must be true, it must be real. But our Lord warned, in those days, there will be miracles to deceive even the elect. And these are the phony miracles, and they've been proven to be phony. Father Cardozo went to Buenos Aires, where there was the one promoted by Bishop Williamson, the so-called Eucharistic miracle. Father Cardozo told us this. He went to the church where this miracle, so-called miracle, took place. He asked the priest to see it. The priest said, no, you can't see it. Normally the miracles are very open and you can see them, like Guadalupe, the image of the tilma. The Eucharistic miracle of Lanciano, you can go see. But in this case, he couldn't see. But what was the church? He said in the church they had adoration of the Blessed Sacrament, if it was truly there, with a huge flowery pastel flowers around the monstrance. That was the monstrance. And it was all the structure of the new Mass. So he said, it's baloney, and very dangerous for souls. At 1 hour and 36 in the interview, does one have to stay absolutely away from the Novus Ordo? What would you say? If you had a relative ask you, can I go to the new Mass? It's a conservative priest. He wears his cassock, he prays the rosary, but he says the new Mass. What are you going to tell them? What would Archbishop Lefebvre tell them? He would say, stay away. Stay away because it's a danger to your faith. In fact, there was a woman in the Trinidad, in the island of Trinidad, where there was no Latin Mass. She wrote a letter to Archbishop Lefebvre in 1976. She says, please, do you think I could go to the most conservative Novus Ordo priest on the island? He wears his cassock, he prays the rosary, he's very devout to Our Lady. Can I go to that new Mass? If she wrote Bishop Williamson, what would he say? Well, of course, no problem. It's an option, yes. What did Archbishop Lefebvre say? He said, do not go. It's too poisonous and too dangerous to the faith. Notice the primacy of the faith, the primacy of God, of Jesus Christ. Don't go, he says, and one of my priests will send you a tape cassette, an audio cassette. Remember those? He'll send you an audio cassette, and you can listen to the song High Mass. And follow that, sanctify the day. What does Bishop Williamson say? And I'm not rejoicing over this. I'm very sad, actually. This is my father of my priesthood. And he's gone liberal. Here's what he says. Does one have to stay absolutely away from the novice ordo? Bishop Williamson answers, no. You can drive around your diocese and look for a priest. He then says your local SSPX priest will probably know conservative novice ordo priests and recommends you to ask him. So that's also a good indicator of what's happening to the SSPX also. They know all the conservative priests in the novice ordo. They're buddies with them. Now, Father Tim Pfeiffer, when I was with him in Syracuse, we made a point to invite novice ordo priests to the meal with the priests, but to convert them, to bring them to tradition, and try to get them to stop saying the new Mass and come to the Catholic fight of Catholic tradition. But that's not the same now anymore. It's wine and cheese over dialogue. It's very dangerous. So Bishop Williamson says, drive around your diocese, drive around the Gardner or Boston or whatever you are, diocese, and try to find the most conservative novice ordo priests you can. And Bishop Lefebvre would say, no, the more conservative, actually, the more dangerous, because they have the veneer of Catholicism, but they're saying that new Mass, which offends God very much. So that's just a little touch on that interview. And Bishop Williamson, he's an old Englishman that's gone liberal. Or maybe he was always liberal, I don't know. But would he say this if Archbishop Lefebvre was still alive? Archbishop Lefebvre would immediately call him and say, take down that interview. That's deceiving the faithful. You do not deceive them this way. And Archbishop Lefebvre would correct this, but he's not around anymore to correct him. So he can get away with saying all this. And look what happened to Bishop Follet. He signed the doctrinal declaration. He's accepted jurisdiction from Pope Francis for confessions, from marriages. All the marriages have to be submitted to the local diocesan bishops. They are in the hands of the novice ordo. That's a fact. I wish it wasn't true. And all the good priests, they are slowly sliding and sliding to at least trim down their sails. That is, stop talking so much against the novice ordo, against Vatican II, against Pope Francis's scandals. And this, even Bishop Follet has clearly done this. When Pope Benedict XVI had the Assisi meeting in 2010, he was pretty much silent about it, because that was when they were going to get their deals in 2011 and 12. So all the bishops of Archbishop Lefebvre have in some way compromised with Vatican II in the new Mass, either by positive compromise or by silence. Bishop Tissier should be raising HELL over all this. But he's saying nothing. He's going right along with it. It's very sad, and we got to pray for them. And it can happen to any of us. We're all in this modernist, liberal, apostate age. We're all in danger of falling to liberalism and falling to compromise. We're all in danger. So we must pray to the Virgin Mary. She hates heresy. She hates all that attacks her Son. And yes, does the Virgin Mary like the new Mass? No, she hates it because it makes a mockery of her Son. Does she like Vatican II and the new Code of Canon Law? No, she hates it because it all directly or indirectly attacks her divine Son. How can she bless and love these things? So let me bring out not to make, you see all these books on the pulpit, you're probably wondering, oh my, this is going to be a long sermon. But it's actually, I don't intend to make a long one, but the point, let it be made, which is an example of two great saints in the time of the French Revolution. One of them is a holy priest. His name was Saint Andrew Fournet, F-O-U-R-N-E-T. And he died in 1834. And then Saint Elizabeth Bichet des Ages. She's we'll just call her Saint Elizabeth Bichet, B-I-C-H-I-E-R, in France. And both of them lived around Poitiers, which is almost the dead center of France. She died in 1838, 4 years after this holy priest. And Providence brought them together. But let's see why. Let's see the reasons. First, St. Elizabeth Bichet, she, as a young girl, was very devout. She was raised in a Catholic family, etc., etc. And at 24 years old, she was being pushed to marry because she was beautiful. And she wrote on her picture, holy card of Our Lady of Perpetual Help, she wrote, I, Joan Elizabeth Mary Lucy Bichet, today dedicate and consecrate myself to Jesus and Mary forever. May 5th, 1797. So at 24 years old, she consecrated her whole life to God. And then she would eventually be led to this priest, and they would found a whole order of nuns called the Daughters of the Cross, or the Daughters of St. Andrew, and they would teach the poor children, especially girls. But listen to this detail. The local parish was in a bad way as a result of the French Revolution, for it had a constitutional priest, that is, a priest who signed the constitutional, the oath of it was called the Civil Constitution of the Clergy. So the clergy had to sign this in order to function as a priest. But in signing it, they had to compromise against the Catholic faith. And they had to accept that the National Assembly could choose bishops, that their salaries came from France and the National Assembly, and they could assign bishops, elect them, and basically a compromise against the faith. So the constitutional clergy could say Mass. They were defended by the French Revolutionary armies. And the Catholic people, what did they do? It was like our situation with the new Mass or priests who compromise. What are you supposed to do? Do you compromise and go with error? No. What did she do in her family? They did not go, and most of the parish, they did not go to this priest, to his Mass. But he could argue and say, wait a minute, I'm saying the Latin Mass. This is a traditional Latin Mass. Why can't you go to it? It's valid, and most certainly was valid. But because he compromised against the faith, the Catholic sense in the people stayed away. And the good clergy, like Father Andrew Fournet, who we'll come to, he also warned and stayed away and risked his life doing so. So in their local parish, this constitutional priest was saying Mass. So what did they do? Every night, St. Elizabeth used to collect the farmers and their wives at La Guimetière for prayers and hymns and spiritual reading. And then she first heard of a priest in a parish 25 miles away who was grappling with a similar situation and had reopened his church in a barn. It was the Abbé Fournet at Maillet, now known as St. Andrew Fournet. So as a result of the French Revolution, the bishops were reduced from 135 to 83 faithful bishops. And then half the priests took the oath. So let's look at Father St. Andrew Fournet. What was he about? He has an interesting childhood. It looks like his parents were really pushy on him to become a priest. and a monk. So he was kind of bored with religion. He was a good student, but when it came to religion, he wasn't all that interested. He wished neither to pray nor to learn. All he wanted to do was to amuse himself. Sounds like the headache of many homeschooling parents. In a book belonging to him when he was a boy and preserved as a relic today, may be read the following words written in his childish handwriting. This book belongs to Andrew Hubert Fournay, a good boy, though he is not going to be a priest or a monk! Exclamation point. But he would also get in fights at the school grounds with other boys. He was kind of a wild kid. But later, his parents, seeing him too wild, they sent him to his uncle, who was a priest in a parish that was a poverty-stricken parish. So he went to live with his uncle, who was a priest. And he probably rolled his eyes. But the priest handled him very well and respected the boy, took care of him, and soon the boy's heart turned. And later, actually, he would become a priest. And not just a priest, but an excellent priest. And here's what happens. This peaceful, happy existence came to an end with the French Revolution, 1789. St. Andrew Fournay refused to take the oath as a priest, which the new government required of the clergy and was consequently outlawed. Only by stealth could he minister to the flock, now saying Mass in the woods, now in a barn, now in a humble cottage, and always at the risk of his life. Towards the end of 1792, at the bidding of his bishop, he retired to Spain, but after an absence of 5 years, he decided that he could no longer leave his flock unshepherded. Secretly, he made his way back to his parish in France, which he entered at dead of night. The news of his return spread like wildfire, and the ministrations were sought on all hands. So everyone wanted the priest to come. The danger, however, was greater than ever. The pursuivants, that is the police, the soldiers of the French Revolution, the Masons, were constantly on his track, and on several occasions he only escaped by the skin of his teeth. Once, as he was sitting by a cottage fire, near the fireplace, the police entered in search of him. The good woman of the house promptly struck and boxed his ears for an idle churl, meaning the woman in the house taking care of the priest. They barge in, and she thinks quick, and she thinks correctly. She walks up to the priest, pounds him in the ears, yanks his earlobes, and says, "Get out of here." And she was treating him like a beggar that was just causing trouble. But the trick worked. And bade him give his place to the gentleman while he went off to mind the cattle. So she told him, "Get out and take care of the cattle. Stop being idle." And she said, "Here, you can take this seat." The ploy and the tactic succeeded. But in telling the story later, St. Andrew was accustomed to add, "She had a heavy hand. She made me see stars." Another day he eluded capture by feigning to be a dead body. The officials sent in search of him. The police broke in, drew back at the sight of a shrouded figure on a bed surrounded by candles and kneeling women. So that was another way he escaped their hands. But this good priest, who worked with St. Elizabeth, founded an order of teaching girls, of nuns. But my point in bringing this out is he would not compromise against the faith. And she, St. Elizabeth, and her mother and father and the other families, they would not go to the priests who compromise against the faith. This is what Bishop Williamson should be saying. Don't go to these new masses, stay away. The faith is more important than getting some emotional, spiritual charge out of a phony new mass. Let me just conclude by one of the traditional priests who concludes this. It's very interesting what he says. He says, faced with all the confusion today on the new Mass and Tridentine Mass, there are three positions people take. One is the right position, which is avoid the new Mass altogether and stay away from compromised Masses. And I would ask, all the bishops now of Bishop Williamson, they have to answer to this. If they stay silent, they agree with him. So Bishop Zendejas, what do you say? Bishop Thomas Aquinas in Brazil, what do you say about this? I don't think he agrees. But he's not allowed to remain silent as a bishop. I know Bishop Thomas Aquinas. He's a very good priest and a fighter. But he gave in on this whole question with the new Mass gives grace, the new Mass you can go to if it's conservative. He caved in on that, at least by silence. So I would ask him, what do you say about this? And Bishop IV, these three bishops consecrated by Bishop Williamson, do they agree with this? And if they do, they completely kick Archbishop Lefebvre in the teeth. And they harm souls by their silence. So I would ask you, write to these bishops. Write them and say, you can't remain silent on this. You must help souls and teach the truth. So the three positions we must condemn and avoid the new Mass. And Archbishop Lefebvre said this, and he based it on doctrinal reasons. If you and I pray as Catholics with the real Catholic Mass of tradition, with the same Mass Father St. Andrew Fournay said and was hunted for, it's the exact same Mass, exact same rubrics, exact same Epistle and Gospel, exact same introit, exact same Mass. This Mass gives grace, the Tridentine Mass. This Mass, because you pray as a Catholic, you believe as a Catholic, and it nourishes your faith. And it nourishes the faith of the priest, because all the movements he makes shouts the belief in the real presence. But the new Mass is all watered down. So it's on doctrinal reasons that Archbishop Lefebvre rejected and condemned the new Mass. And he did say, especially in the 1970s and early 80s, when a lot of the old priests were forced to accept the new Mass, and they falsely obeyed, and they were saying the new Mass, he says in many cases these could be valid if it's the proper matter, form, and intention. That's what's required. But Archbishop Lefebvre also says, but as time goes on, the young priests formed in modernism, they won't know the old Mass, and more invalid Masses will take place. So most of these Novus Ordo Masses today are doubtful, if they're even valid. So we have to reject the new Mass and not go to it, and also compromise Masses. He says, this priest, for many in this camp, the affiliations or theological ideas of the priest are not necessarily important. He may be an older priest, an SSPX priest, a sedevacantist or FSSP, St. Peter priest, a Feniite or a diocesan priest operating with approval from his ordinary, that is the bishop. What counts is that the priest celebrates some form of the traditional Latin Mass. And for some people, they fall into this. While the underlying instinct at work here is fundamentally around the Mass of Paul VI is wrong and must be avoided, the solution is visceral. I am repelled by the new Mass, so I'll take any Latin Mass that comes my way. And this position is dangerous. All who adhere to this position would no longer condemn the liturgical anarchy that the Vatican II reforms unleashed. But by not looking beyond the narrow question of which Mass they prefer, they become merely one more factor contributing to the chaos. So any Latin Mass will do, and that's dangerous. That didn't work for these saints of the French Revolution. It was all Latin Mass. There was no such thing as a new Mass. But they knew if the priest compromised, they could not go to that Mass. That's Catholic, and that's our position. That's the position of Archbishop Lefebvre. It's the position of the SSPX Marian Corps and Catholic Resistance. Same thing. Second position, the coexistence of both rites. This school of thought proposed that the Mass of Paul VI, the new Mass, and the traditional Mass be allowed to coexist on an equal footing. Assistance at either rite would then become a matter not of obligation, but rather of choice for the individual Catholic. If the new Mass appealed to you, fine. If the old Mass appealed to you, fine also. Whatever. Now this is the new position of Bishop Williamson. The underlying assumption was that no substantial differences exist between the two rites. Both are equally Catholic, both authentically represent the Church's law of believing, and both are equally reverent. So the decision to assist at the traditional Latin Mass is not a matter of obligation. The new Mass destroys the faith, and I must therefore seek out a rite that is Catholic, but merely of individual preference. I like the old Mass better. This is essentially the principle that Pope Benedict XVI implemented in his 2007 Motu Proprio Summorum Pontificum. The new Mass, he declared, would henceforth be the ordinary form of the Roman Rite, while the old Mass would be the so-called extraordinary form of the Roman Rite. Both are two uses of one and the same rite, he says, and would mutually enrich each other. And this is what Bishop Follet praised to the high heavens. He praised this document, when Archbishop Lefebvre would have absolutely condemned it, because it puts the new Mass on an equal level with the traditional Mass. It puts the Catholic faith on an equal level with apostasy and mockery of Christ. Coexistence was also the solution, this priest says, with this whole idea that let's have the experiment of tradition. And he says this was the mistake of Archbishop Lefebvre in the beginning. In the beginning, Archbishop Lefebvre did say this. Archbishop Lefebvre said, well, let's do the experiment of tradition. And both rites can coexist, but the Archbishop thought, well, because the traditional Mass is Catholic, people will drop the new Mass and stay with tradition. But that was at the beginning. Later, he condemned and instead stay away from the new Mass. And that's also in the seminary in Econ. He would tell the seminarians, he would say, yeah, go to the most traditional conservative Novus Ordo Mass you can find. He would say that. But later, he said he was wrong. He said, don't go to the new Mass. So he changed his position. But Bishop Williamson is going from the bishop position of Archbishop Lefebvre in his wise years back to a liberal position. There are two problems with this solution, so-called. First, those who accept the coexistence of both rites, new Mass and old Mass, in exchange for official recognition, neutralize their capacity to wage any serious battles against the errors and evils of the new Mass. So now the SS Peter, they can't condemn the new Mass from the pulpit. They never could. And now the new SSPX, since Bishop Follet has officially accepted the new Mass as legitimately promulgated, they cannot attack the new Mass like the priests of yesteryear in the society. And now they're buddying up to all these Novus Ordo bishops, so they're not going to say the new Mass is evil, it's intrinsically evil, it makes you lose the faith, it's poisonous. They're not going to say that anymore. They're going to say it's not a good option. They're going to say it's not as reverent as the traditional Mass. But that's a dangerous way of speaking, and listen why. Sure, they can express reservations about the rite or even criticize the new Mass, albeit diplomatically. Its many shortcomings and defects, but he who dares speak the truth that the new Mass is a sacrilege and destroys Catholic doctrine will soon find himself silenced. Groups that receive official Vatican approval for an apostolate that promotes the old Mass, such as the Fraternity of St. Peter, Institute of Christ the King, and we can now add the new SSPX, must therefore necessarily trim their sails and follow the course of self-censorship, even though most of their priests, one suspects, are appalled by the new Mass and do not really consider it an alternative Roman rite. Second, in light of our conclusions about the doctrinal content of the Mass of Paul VI, and that new Mass is doctrinally, as Archbishop Lefebvre said, if you pray like a Protestant in the new Mass, you're going to start believing like a Protestant. If you pray like a modernist, you're going to start believing like a modernist. So he says, To do so would reduce the principle lex orandi, lex credendi, the law of prayer is the law of belief, to an absurdity, because despite Pope Benedict XVI's claim in Summorum Pontificum that the law of prayers in both rites is the same, the law of praying of the Mass of Paul VI in fact destroys the very law of belief that the traditional Latin Mass professes. How can these two rites then be treated as mere options, alternative equivalents in the practical order? How can participating in a rite which professes the Catholic faith or participating in a rite which destroys the Catholic faith be reduced to a mere preference? And this is what you could say to Bishop Williamson. Why would you say that's a preference to go to a new Mass, even though it's conservative, and even if the new Mass is in Latin facing the altar? And I remember in the seminary, Bishop Williamson making this point, that he said, and I remember accurately, and I'm sure the other seminarians, priests now who would agree, he said, even the new Mass facing the altar in Latin with Gregorian chant is dangerous and poisonous to the faith. That was Bishop Williamson of yesteryear. And now he's become quite liberal. I don't know, pray for him. But it's poisonous. This is poisonous advice. Imagine Archbishop Lefebvre telling you, you can go to the new Mass, just find a conservative priest. Father Bulldog would never say that, I know that. How can these two rites then be treated as mere options, alternative equivalents in the practical order? How can participating in a rite which professes the Catholic faith or participating in a rite which destroys the faith be reduced to a mere preference, one that is contingent upon nothing more than attachment, my affection, my culture, my personal familiarity, or upon whether one appreciates a sacrality which attracts many people? To propose coexistence is to embrace wittingly or unwittingly the dogma-free religion of the modernists. And that's the danger of Bishop Williamson's position. It's a modernist, it's part of the modernist church. It is the Novus Ordo religion, where personal religious sentiment is king. Thus, a Catholic is free to choose any liturgical style for the Mass that appeals to him, be it Life-tine or Tridentine, because doctrine is secondary, and because everything in the modernist sacramental system, as St. Pius X said, is explained by an inner impulse or need. And this is exactly why St. Peter's exists, because they treat the Latin Mass or the indult Masses. It's a need, it's an emotional impulse that traditional Catholics need. Very dangerous. Very, very dangerous. And this is what Archbishop Lefebvre saw after dealing with the modernists, that it's not a matter of option, it's a matter of staying with Christ the King and the Catholic faith. And they reduced the Latin Mass to just an option. So I like the Latin Mass because it makes me feel good, but I won't condemn your option to go to the new Mass. And this is very dangerous. This is modernism, and we're living it right now. And modernism is now in the head of Bishop Williamson. I hate to say that, and I wish it wasn't true. But if I start talking like this, I also am imbued with modernism. And I have to warn you as a true shepherd, as St. Andrew Fournay would say himself, stay away from the new Mass, stay away from all compromised Masses, period. Because the faith is more important than your emotional inner impulse or needs, as St. Pius X said himself about modernism. Let me just close with what he says here. In the grave of reverence towards the Blessed Sacrament and the sacred character of the Mass that is integral to the new rite, with coexistence, sacrilege is merely a legitimate alternative to the sacrality which attracts many people in the old rite. If you are not attracted by sacrality or religious feeling, well then, there is always the ordinary form of the Roman rite. Sacrality or sacrilege, it's your choice. New Mass or Old Mass, sacrilege or sacrality or religious feeling or sacrilege, it's your choice. And he makes an excellent conclusion here. With coexistence, therefore, the Old Mass, the Catholic doctrine it expresses, and the reverential spirit it exudes, are just one more attraction in the big tent of the post-Vatican II liturgical circus. But if you are attracted by the new Mass, its assembly theology, and its low sacrality content, not to worry. There's also a place for you in the tent. Just look for the cardinal with the balloon. His Eminence is standing next to the calliope and not far from the clowns. Very well said, but very true. And this was the position of Archbishop Lefebvre. I don't need to tell you, don't go to the new Mass. But I do have to warn you of the danger of modernism in the minds of our 4 bishops consecrated by Archbishop Lefebvre. How did this happen? How, it's lamentable. How could this happen? But it should make us fear and tremble, lest any of us, says St. Paul, that he who thinks he stands tremble, lest he fall. Let us be humbly devout and devoted and manfully attached to Catholic tradition. And we won't stay this way unless we're deeply attached to the Virgin Mary. She is the mother who crushes all heresy. She is the queen, she's the virgin, she's the immaculate. And with her we'll stay immaculate in our Catholic faith and in our heart and in our mind, in our body and soul. Without her, we're going to crumble. And you might say, well, Bishop Williamson prays the Rosary, Bishop Fillet prays the Rosary. They all are devoted to Mary. How could this happen? I can't explain that. I don't know. But it shows how evil modernism really is. That even someone who has some devotion to Our Lady can fall into it. Let's just hope Our Lady saves their souls. Because modernism, it makes you lose the faith. So stay attached to the Virgin Mary, but back it with study. Read Archbishop Lefebvre's great writings, especially they have uncrowned him. Read all his works. Read Father Denis Fahey. Read Cardinal Pio Poitiers. Read the old articles of the Angelus before 2012. They're all good. They're all good. The old SSPX. And read also the Recusant out of England. There's a new one coming out soon. Read the Catacombs. That has excellent articles, catacombs.org. Read the encyclicals of the popes. They strengthen your faith. And you might say, well, popes, they're writing to bishops. That's way above my head. Well, some of them are. I agree. But not all. And some of these basic encyclicals are very good. Quas Primas, condemning the secularist society and proclaiming the kingship of Christ. That's easy to follow. Mirari Vos of Gregory XVI is also excellent, condemning separation of church and state. And the Syllabus of Errors is pretty clear-cut. And the Quanta Cura, they're very clear-cut. The encyclicals of Pius X are excellent. Pascendi is meat and potatoes. It is tough. You got to read it a few times. But you can see how he condemns the new Mass and the new Vatican II religion. So hold fast to the faith, little flock. Do not be deceived. Pray for our 4 bishops of Archbishop Lefebvre. Pray for them. It's lamentable, but pray for them. And let us attach ourselves strongly to Catholic tradition, to the Virgin Mary. Hold on to her mantle. She'll shield you from all the heresies and errors of our time. O Mary, conceived without sin. Pray for us, O Mary, conceived without sin. Pray for us, O Mary, conceived without sin. Pray for us, and for those who do not have recourse to thee, especially all communists and Freemasons and other enemies of Holy Mother Church. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen.